time to wrap up the stream with a reaction video. This will be the last piece of content we do of the night before talking to you boys and answering any questions.
Before I go the fuck to bed.
There you go. So Mark, let me know let me know whenever you want to pause. Now, the reason I'm playing this video is for anybody that's new here or wasn't here, I did a panel. Joe Lewis was on the panel, and we were talking about Jordan Peterson and the intellectual dark web. During that discussion, I brought up that they were trying to say that he was a pipeline to the alt-right. And I brought up that the real reason people don't like Jordan Peterson is not because he's a pipeline to the alt-right, which is an absurd fucking accusation. Dave Grohl, Eric Clapton? No, this is Ryan Chapman. Generic white name like Dave or Eric, and Chapman is very close to Clapton, so you weren't that far off. What ended up happening is I said, no, he calls out Marxism and radical postmodernism and is a danger to the fact that all of these fucking hardcore lefty Marxists are in the institutions and have moved out of the institutions, and the intellectual dark web specifically, Jordan Peterson has shined a light on these things and shown it for what they were. And then what Joe Lewis did is consistently redefine classical postmodernism, ignoring radical postmodernism, and then doing a very paltry job of trying to hide what classical postmodernism was and how pernicious its ideas really are. And then when I kept trying to hammer him on it, he screamed over me and said racist shit. So I figured now would be a good time to do two things: to give some love to a channel that is overwhelmingly smaller than it should be, with only 27.8K subscribers, and to a person that does amazing work, as well as react to this. I've seen this video. Mark has not seen this video, so we can go through it, and so you guys can have a little bit better understanding of the difference between classical or French postmodernism and radical postmodernism that we have today, and what those differences are. This guy does amazing work. Yeah, I mean, like, post the link in chat. Of course, I will absolutely post the link in chat. You should absolutely check out this guy's content. He deserves all the subscribers and likes and love. And he's got a ton of other videos that are all just as good as this video. My favorite is his one on the New Left. It's an hour long, but it might as well be 20 books worth of information. But with that being said, we're going to hop in.
Yeah, let's go.
Everyone, today is Postmodernism Day. It's a popular thing to talk about. I think most people don't realize that there's two different types of it. There's the leftist identity politics version, and then there's also the old dead French guy version. And they're not quite the same, so I'm going to parse out the difference between the two. This might seem like a obscure thing to talk about, but if you stick with me till the end, I think you'll see why this is important and worth our time. I'm guessing that we're less familiar with the old French version, so I'm going to spend a bunch of time laying that out, and when we come around to modern leftist identity politics, I'm guessing that we're more familiar with it, so I'm going to go straight to just critiquing it and compare it to the old French version. And just as a spoiler alert, in that comparison, it's not going to be very flattering for leftist identity politics. So be warned, that's coming up. And yeah, let's talk postmodernism.
First of all, what went through my mind is how stupid am I to actually volunteer for this?
Truth?
This is the weirdest fucking breakdown ever. That's so fucking strange. But yeah, let's go into it, boys.
Knowledge, reason, progress. These are the core values of the intellectual and philosophical movement called modernism. There's also an art movement called modernism, but this is typically the modernism that the name postmodernism refers to. These are also interchangeably called Enlightenment era values, but we're going to keep on using the term modernism for this video because it's easier.
Okay, hold on, pause, one cut.
Called Enlightenment era values.
If we got any objectivists in the chat, all right, just go ahead and pat yourself on the back. I want you to bust that nut real quick, because I know you saw truth, knowledge, reason, progress, and you heard him supporting modernism and Enlightenment values. I know you need to just go ahead and go get those fucking Kleenexes and clean up your area a little bit. We're going to move forward without you, but I appreciate you being here, objectivists. We love you.
We need to start calling them Randy Marshes.
Give me some wet naps. All right, boys. All right, we're gonna pull forward though.
But we're going to keep on using the term modernism for this video because it's easier. Modernism is essentially the belief in human progress through the development of human knowledge. A good example of a quintessential modernist book is this one, the Encyclopedia. Modernism was all about trying to sharpen up human thinking and get...
I'm sorry. I love how petty, how he's both petty and supportive. A good example of a modernist book is this one, an encyclopedia.
Rid of the book is this one.
You know, just fucking knowledge.
The encyclopedia. Modernism was all about trying to sharpen up human thinking and get rid of loose, lazy thinking. It was all about trying to pin down and arrange truth into verifiable boxes. And that all sounds good, but it's always been controversial. So say if you're using empiricism to try to establish some idea of objective truth, and along the way you don't put God in the answer, for a lot of people that's not going to go over so well. But this video isn't about them. This video is about postmodernists. The original postmodernists were French intellectuals who, starting in the 60s, embodied the disillusioned post-World War II pushback against modernism from the left. They basically said that we've all drank the modernism Kool-Aid, and that modernism is too constrictive, and we need to loosen up our thinking in order to free ourselves and see all these aspects of the world that we've been blind to. If there's the clean antonym for simplification, I think that would describe postmodernism well. You could say complication. Postmodernism is the complication of modernism. Simplification is basically garlic to postmodernists. In the spirit of complication, the original postmodernists pushed this idea that there's no one objectively correct way to view anything, which was designed to give a hard time to people who had high opinions of these values. To postmodernists, knowledge isn't objective, and it's not something that's out there in the external world, like behind a bush somewhere waiting to be discovered. To postmodernists, knowledge is a subjective social construction that's created using the subjective human toolbox, like the brain. And it's further disconnected from reality because we formulate it using the artifice of language. In their eyes, this all makes any human attempts at getting a handle on any kind of objective reality inherently compromised and prone to human fallibility.
So, if you've had any conversation with an objectivist, right now they're hardcore triggered, right?
They're upset.
They're upset, right? Because it is a denial of any objective reality and a denial of any objective truth, and then a denial that our brain has the capacity to understand objective truth, and then a denial that language can be used to describe said objective truth that wasn't discovered by our subjective brain, it doesn't exist in a subjective universe. Essentially, when you add that many layers of subjectivity to everything, you really bring in this pernicious idea that nothing can be discovered and nothing can be known. Which, you know, is a big problem. Right? I mean, it's a bit like, even me as a functionalist that honestly believes in this. You know, I still work under the precept that, like, okay, cool, but I'm not going to be a crazy person. And so I'm going to work under the idea that objective reality can be discovered. I'm going to work under the assumption that objective truth is real because it appears to be such to me. But these guys just deny it completely and throw out its uses, right? They say that, well, this is all like, you know, like, how do you deny objective truth, at least in its usage and believing in it, right? When planes fly and they crash rarely. Right? Like what evidence are you using when we discover things, especially in the hard sciences, and then that pattern always repeats itself? At a certain point, you have to, at the very least, assume it's true. To deny that is just complete absurdity and stupidity. Facts, Tower.
Another postmodern argument is that we privilege some things at the expense of marginalizing others. So to give an example, let's say the internet's developed, YouTube comes around, and we start to privilege, and by privilege I mean pay a bunch of attention to.
There are arguments against all that. No shit, Sherlock. Postmodernists have been in the fucking academics. Like, what are you just being fucking... I get it, Armand. I know that you're a troll. Like, we used to call you Tyranno-Fluid. I'm taking that title away from you. And the reason is because you develop whatever ideology is going to be against the person you're talking to.
So he's a trollosexual?
Yeah. He's troll fluid. Like, I now know your game, right? Like, you don't believe multiple different ideologies. You just adopt whatever ideology is going to trigger your opponent.
At the expense of marginalizing others. So to give an example, let's say the internet's developed, YouTube comes around, and we start to privilege, and by privilege I mean pay a bunch of attention to, the method of, say, concepts being explained through video at the cost of marginalizing concepts being explained, say, through books. And they try to even that out. They say we should see the flaws that we might be blind to in the things that we're privileging, and we should see the values that we might be overlooking in the things that we're marginalizing. These are relativistic arguments. Since our attempts to understand the world are artificial and subjective and prone to human error, we can never be fully sure that our ideas are objectively correct or that our values are superior to the ideas or values of people in, say, other cultures. So they might say that a modernist who believes that the scientific method is objectively the best framework for trying to understand the world is marginalizing and maybe even oppressing someone in a different side of the world who maybe thinks that the best framework to build knowledge and understanding is maybe spiritual based.
Yeah, well, they'd be wrong.
Here's some relativism put plainly by one of the original postmodernists in a more recent book, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. Another major postmodernly by
Consensual traditionalism, that of the Enlightenment, the rights of man, the left in power, the repentant intellectual and sentimental humanism, is every bit as fierce as that of any tribal religion or primitive society. No, it's not. One gives us answers to things, and the other gatekeeps knowledge as assumed. The scientific method and modernist philosophy is clearly better.
one of the
I think the sentence before that is more important. We do not practice hard fundamentalist traditionalism. We practice soft, subtle, and shameful democratic traditionalism by consensus.
Right. Simulacrum and simulation, Mark Brillard. I can't ever some French spelling. Yeah, it's Jean. It's Jean. Right here, Jean Baudrillard.
Original postmodernists in a more recent book, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. Another major postmodern argument says that in the social construction of things, there are hidden dynamics of power everywhere, and they see it as their job to give us the tools to unmask those dynamics so that people can see them plainly, and in doing that, become more free.
I kind of agree with this to a certain extent. Right? Like, I do think that we bring our biases into the way that we choose to do science, especially not so much hard science. I think that's bullshit. But like when you're talking about sociology or psychology and things like that, we bring our biases there, and there are, you know, what you might describe hidden power dynamics that are there, right? In viewing things from our own perspective.
That might all sound good to you, but you might be less thrilled about it once they start applying that.
Yeah, we don't believe in democracy, real Green Knight, only as a tool to get rid of the state.
To science. They were definitely criticized at the time, but I think the original postmodernists saved themselves some trouble by avoiding making any kind of strong statement about core beliefs outright. So their writing reads more like swimming in circles, where they'll take little jabs at modernism here and there, but they'll never commit to, say, a more direct takedown of it. And a lot of the quotes out there that seem like they're doing a good job of summarizing postmodern thought actually aren't from the original postmodernists. They're actually falsely attributed, and they're from experts that are trying to summarize the original postmodernists. So with science, they'll take little jabs at it here and there. They'll say that science can't be objective because its researchers are inherently biased. And they'll say that science has been terribly wrong in the past, and that we've used...
Yeah, and that's just not true for hard science, right? Like, to say that you can't be objective when studying chemistry in a lab is fucking absurd and stupid.
I hold a ball up and I drop it and I say the ball fell. Is that an objective truth?
No, that's your Western bias about what falling even means, and Lacan would argue that your language is an impossibility to describe the scenario adequately, because falling might mean something different to another person. In other cultures, falling actually, you know, pertains to the body, and how could your body have fallen? Like, it's fucking stupid. That's what they really legitimately believe.
Just find me one person who actually believes that.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Kazuya 246. Exactly. Science is a process that reduces bias as much as possible. Though I do agree, right, with some of original classical postmodernism in being aware that our bias does affect everything that we do, and that sometimes that can have effects in the soft sciences, right? Like in literary critique, or in critiquing sociology or societies, or, you know, psychology in the brain, like the human, or economics, right? Like, as an Austrian, we deny that you can even really fully reach full conclusions in economic theory. Though I'm more of a neoclassical myself, because I do think that there are patterns that can be seen within people. Even still, your biases affect that. I mean, look at fucking Paul Krugman. Like, that motherfucker was so biased in his scientific process that he somehow proved and won a Nobel Prize, along with plenty other people, right? That proving that minimum wage doesn't affect unemployment. The fuck? That's just obviously not true. And you can deduce that via logic that that's not true. And like they weaseled the way that they were so biased in their process as to prove that, so that everyone could be like, see, we can raise minimum wage whenever we want.
As researchers are inherently biased, and they'll say that science has been terribly wrong in the past and that we've used it as a tool to oppress other cultures. But they'll never say to get rid of science altogether, and it's hard to find any one sentence or two that totally encapsulates their view towards science. So some people will say that postmodernism is anti-science, but I think that's a strong statement. I think that they were trying to tell us that we've been overvaluing science and that we should be more skeptical of it to see the flaws. So you might not like them and you might not like how they did it, but I think it's good to try to be fair to them and to try to appreciate that the original postmodernists were probably sincerely trying to help people. They're trying to get them to think for themselves, and they're trying to free them from what they saw as the oppressive aspects of society. Foucault, for example, tried to make us more aware of how modernist Western culture marginalizes people who we label as mentally ill more than we did in previous eras. Or in another book, he warned...
Yeah, Roland, the studies mostly use 10% raises because the assumption was based off of a 10% raise led to a 1% unemployment, what's known as like teenage employment is what they used to say, instead of like basically talking about fast food workers, a bunch of fast food. And they changed all of the models, right? What we used to do in the, before the 90s is we used to compare like cities. So we would do a 10% raise in New York, then there would be no raise in LA or Chicago, and we would compare the two. What we would find is a 10% raise in minimum wage led to a 1% unemployment in that specific category, which minimum wage workers. What they did instead is they were like, oh, well, see, the demographics aren't actually good enough. What we need to do a nearby city that has the nearby culture. The problem is that they would take New York City and then they would take upstate Jersey and then they would use that as a means. But the problem is that you can't really disconnect those two economies. When you have a 10% raise in one place, the minimum wage, it affects the economy equally in New York City as it does in upstate New Jersey, because these people are the same people. A lot of people, drive from upstate New Jersey to work in there. And so what they did is they intentionally used very close together cities that are wildly different in socioeconomic status, racial makeup, culture, et cetera, but whose economies were tied together to then try and prove the idea that minimum wage had no impact whatsoever on unemployment. But it was just trash fucking science. I admit it, I'm biased against tenors. Only basses here, baby.
I have no idea what I would be.
Probably a baritone.
Just how the threat of surveillance can condition...
Oh, that's a bass. Baritone is just like a regular male voice without music.
He warned us how the threat of surveillance can condition society into docile
for real though, the panopticon was fucking dope.
Conformity, and how the process of taking criminal punishment out from the public square and moving it behind closed prison doors actually consolidates state power, since it lets them conduct power games over prisoners while staying mostly out of the public mind. That last one might seem pretty obscure, but you could definitely make it relevant. You could apply it to, say, Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, and use it to say that the state's very public punishment of those individuals was actually pretty risky for the state to do, since it sets the stage for a public backlash. To me, these are nuanced and deeply humane arguments that are trying to encourage people to question things and to think for themselves, to break outside of social conditioning and to therefore become more free. A rare, pretty straightforward definition of postmodernism did come from this guy towards the end of the movement. After prefacing that he's simplifying to the extreme, which to me reads like he's wincing while he does it, he says that postmodernism is defined by an incredulity towards meta-narratives, which is generally accepted to mean skepticism towards big stories that we forward to each other about how the world works.
Right. Which should be against Marxism.
This meant that there was a box around postmodernism. It could only describe problems and couldn't prescribe solutions, because prescribing a solution would be creating a meta-narrative of your own. So it had all these critiques towards modernism and by extension Western civilization in its toolkit, but postmodernism couldn't provide a framework around what to do with those critiques. So if someone wanted to make a functional movement out of postmodernism, they'd have to take some aspects of it, but throw away others.
Way too much like a girl I used to know.
Well, I mean, it's edited.
It's distracting.
It's edited, so there's jump cuts. Right, and it's sped up, yeah. Yeah, and they lie and convolute the truth, leading to the same problems. Right, and this is why I said last night, or not last night, but the night before last stream, where I said that they'll often use postmodernism as a shield of any critique, right? And then they use Marxism, Marxist praxis as an attack. They do the both they do them both at the same time, right? So they'll use methods of postmodernism to deconstruct the ideas, but they're using a Marxist framework to establish those new things. Like they use these two together as a means of like protecting themselves from any critique, and by deconstructing and destroying any idea or argument that.
Writers and activists must have seen that opportunity, because between the late 80s and early 90s, there was a flurry of writing that did just that, fusing postmodernism with leftist identity politics. It's a bit of a contentious thing to say, and some people will deny it, but it's all over feminist and critical race theorist writing at the time. Here's the paper that introduced intersectionality, and the writer clearly says intersectionality is an attempt to fuse postmodernism with contemporary politics, by which we're supposed to assume she means leftist identity politics. Around the same time, in the book that argued for gender being a social construction, Judith Butler explicitly named Foucault as her basis for doing so. And again, around the same time, bell hooks used postmodernism to call on people to form coalitions along the lines of identity and embrace their own meta-narrative, that the world is roughly broken into two groups, of the oppressed and the oppressors, and the oppressed need to band together. In her adaptation, Hooks uses the term radical postmodernism, and I think that works pretty well. So I'm going to keep on using that term going forward for the rest of this video.
So, yeah. So this is the type of shit that I was trying to point out to Joe Lewis, right? Is like this idea that like when we attack postmodernists, and when Jordan Peterson is attacking postmodernists, he's not talking about fucking Foucault. I mean, he is to a degree in the way that they are anti-science and anti-empiricism. He's talking about the ideas of this new radical Marxist left that has fused postmodernist philosophy along with cultural Marxism and Marxist philosophy, Marxist, analysis and critique, all together into this mishmash of this new form of Marxism that is designed to do the exact same thing Marx was trying to do, which is deconstruct society and initiate revolution against the institution.
To keep their version separate from the original French postmodernism. Those are all major texts from feminism and critical race theory, and there's countless more that explicitly spelled out the adaptation happening at the time. You can still see the adaptation of postmodernism in feminism and critical race theory today, but they don't use the word as often, and I think that's because the adaptation at that point had already been done and the concepts are intrinsically fused. Here's a recent, clear example of radical postmodernism by a critical race theorist that we're all pretty familiar with by now. The word postmodernism doesn't show up, but the concept is there. The major ideas that radical postmodernists took from French postmodernists are one...
What were you laughing at? Sorry?
But
Robin DiAngelo is like someone we're all really familiar with, and then you see at the very bottom, Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah, but instead of the rich versus poor of Marx, it's the oppressed versus oppressor of some French guys. I mean, exactly. I mean, you can substitute any of them, right? So it's it's fucking, it's
left versus right.
If it's critical race theory, it's the whites are the oppressors, the oppressed are the racial minorities. If it's feminism, it's men and the patriarchy are oppressing women. If it's fucking the LGBT community, it's heteronormativity and cisgendered individuals oppressing the LGBT community. I mean, it's all different forms of cultural Marxism. People say, like, now you can't even say cultural Marxism without them saying it's some right-wing dog whistle to Nazis and like a theory of the Jews. And it's one more victory that the Marxists have won, where they've been able to take their own ideas and naming their own ideas for what they are has now become a dog whistle of Nazism, because you're actually able to see their bullshit. Substitute any other dichotomy and call them oppressor and oppressor. Pretty much, yeah. She wrote a book with Oism Sensory in 2011, and White Privilege was also a paper in 2009 or 2011. Yeah, no, I mean, people try and distance themselves from Robin DiAngelo ever since White Fragility came out, and being like, oh, she's fake. But it's like, no, dude, she wrote tons of academic papers, critical race theory. And now they're trying to pretend like she's not, because she became they tried to gatekeep her out of that movement so they can say like, oh, that's not what we believe. And it's like, no, it is. But Wikipedia says it's a conspiracy theory. Wikipedia is objective truth.
Not according to them.
These scholars argue that a key element of social injustice involves the claim that particular knowledge is objective and universal. An approach based on critical theory calls into question the idea that objectivity is desirable or even possible. The term used to describe this way of thinking about knowledge is that knowledge is socially constructed. When we refer to knowledge as socially constructed, we mean that knowledge is reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. This term captures the understanding that all contexts, all means of knowing are connected to a social context.
Critical race theorists that we're all pretty familiar with by now. The word postmodernism doesn't show up, but the concept is there. The major ideas that radical postmodernists took from French postmodernists are 1, seeing the world through the hidden dynamics of power and oppression. 2 is the problematization of Western civilization and, by extension, modernist values like objective truth, and replacing that with emphasizing personal truth and cultural relativism. And 3 is seeing concepts through the lens of social construction, and that gives them the tools to marginalize those concepts if those concepts are inconvenient. This new radical postmodernism doesn't...
Dude, he's so fucking petty and so well informed. Like, it's like, and they can just, marginalize those concepts if they're... I fucking love his work, and he puts so much data in such a small video. I'm sorry, let me go back.
And the tools to marginalize those concepts if those concepts are inconvenient. This new radical postmodernism doesn't have any of the hesitance towards making strong, overarching statements and making their own meta-narratives that the original French postmodernists had. And I think...
Yes, Road to Serfdom absolutely did.
I think it's interesting looking at how that meta-narrative was created, because it wasn't created with modernist values. It wasn't created using, say, first principles and rational thinking that's built from the ground up and would hold up well in good faith debate. And it wasn't made using the best empirical evidence that we have available. Instead, it was made using singular data points here and there, if they're convenient and often out of context. And much more importantly, it was made through the authority of experience and collective known truth. This would make them vulnerable to anyone that tries to use reason to try to make radical postmodernism square with, objective reality. But not so fast, because radical postmodernism has a toolkit that gets them out of it. So, for example, you might ask for evidence to substantiate a claim that a radical postmodernist makes. And they might say, in this case, they don't need science. Science is a white male construct, and people of color already know it's true. Maybe you're invested in the conversation, and you go out and you find evidence, and that evidence contradicts what the radical postmodernist was saying. In their minds, they don't have to respect that because they already know it's true. And they can declare, again, the science is just a white male construct. And they decide they're just going to avoid any of this unpleasantness from ever happening again. So they decide they're going to publicly make an example out of you and call your behavior racist. And maybe now you're really involved, and you're saying, what about my behavior is racist? They might struggle making your behavior square up to the actual definition of racism, but to them that's not a problem either, because words are just social constructs, and they can change the definition of them as needed. The original...
He's so... Dude, he fucking lays out the tactic perfectly and so succinctly, like with like just one example. Like, I love his use of a narrative example here, where he just shows all the tactics very quickly without explaining how they use each of these tactics.
Original French postmodernists, at least in my read, I think we're trying to bring nuance to modernism. I think they're trying to act like a supplemental garnish to the main course of modernism without ever totally overthrowing it. I think in comparison, the radical postmodernists, in their aggressiveness against rationality and in their aggressive subjective redefinition of these values, I think they become something else entirely. I think they become actively anti-modern. And in the spirit of being anti-modern, radical postmodernists frame their meta-narratives through rational contradiction and ask that you hold these rational contradictions in your head without questioning them. So they'll ask you to believe, on one hand, of course, all races are equal. There's no one race of people that are inferior or superior to another. But then they'll also say, on the other hand, there's that one race of people that are inherently racist. Or they'll ask you to think, of course, men and women are equal, or at least they will be once we convince men that masculinity is a psychological disorder. You're supposed to believe in free speech, but don't forget to censor speech if it's offensive to radical postmodernism. If you're a good radical postmodernist, you're supposed to think that all cultures are equally deserving of respect, unless you're talking about Western culture, which is, of course, uniquely tyrannical and needs to be dissolved. You may be ascertaining that I'm not displaying the same level of respect here as I was for the original French postmodernists. And you're correct. What I just described was a bunch of textbook Orwellian doublethink, and that's not a flattering thing to say.
Like this is also the video where he goes in on these people a lot more than he does on some of his other videos. Marcuse's repressive tolerance. Yeah, where you're allowed to be intolerant to conservatives because they're intolerant. And so any means of intolerance towards them is just in the name of tolerance. While his soy voice bothers me, it might actually be beneficial to convincing lefties because he sounds like them. Dude, look, all right. The dude knows his shit. You get out of here. You get out of here with this fucking iron-pilled Chad fucking argument, all right? Mark's over here dealing with the existential crisis of living in an apartment building. Fucking PTSD is kicking in. There's noises.
I can hear someone's TV over my headphones.
Fucking, you must have an old neighbor. They like to have it both ways when it's convenient. Trust the science when the science contradicts them. Science was always racist anyways, right?
Okay,
And
so
I
I
don't
have like
respect it
15
because it's not an
minutes.
Well, luckily, there's only like 6 minutes left.
honest
30
ideology.
minutes, got it.
If you ask a radical postmodernist what their view is all about, they'd say it's about these things. Even granting for a moment that that's true on some level, that doesn't really tell you much. These values, or at least these values, are things that most people would claim that they think. What defines radical postmodernism, what makes them distinct from most other people, is that they also think these things. These are the things that define their behavior. And the thing is, these are mutually exclusive values. You can't think this, that one race is inherently problematic, and also this, that all races are equal. That's logically nonsensical. Trying to convince people that you think both these things is like trying to convince people that 2 + 2 is 5. So it's one or the other. If you think these things, then you don't actually think these things. If you've seen my other videos and me analyzing other topics, I would hope that you'd at least grant me that I try to be honest, even with concepts and movements I disagree with. But radical postmodernism is tricky. I think everything I just described was a pretty logical, straightforward interpretation of radical postmodernism. But virtually no radical postmodernist would agree with my characterization of them. So something's got to give. I think a radical postmodernist would defend their position by saying that they're actually all about these first values. This is what they actually think, and this is the world that they're trying to build towards. And these second values are just things that they embody to achieve the first. And maybe, but to me, when I look at their writing and I look at their behavior, that doesn't quite square with reality. What I see is strong belief in these second values. And these first values, to me, I see as things that they tell themselves. I think this first part is something that they may have sincerely believed when they first got started in the movement, but somewhere got lost along the way. And because they're anti-modern, they've problematized logic when that logic is inconvenient. So they can't use logic to parse through these thoughts and clearly see their own movement. While I think the original French postmodernists were...
Dude, that is the most scathing fucking thing, and it's 100% true.
He's pretty on the ball with it.
Dude, I love this guy's videos. Like, you should absolutely check out his channel. I'll repost this video again so you can find his other videos, because it's absolutely worth it.
We're sincerely trying to expand people's minds and to get them to think about the world in more nuanced ways. I think radical postmodernism does the opposite. It presents the world in its meta-narrative in a simplified form of oppressed versus oppressor and good versus evil, and basically says we all need to get on the same page. We all need to think the same in order for good to prevail under the thumb of evil. I think the original French postmodernists were trying to encourage us to be more skeptical about the world. And I think that radical postmodernists do the opposite. In their meta-narratives, they happily make strong statements about the world that are supposed to radically redefine how we look at it. And we're not supposed to be skeptical of those statements. You're not supposed to run those statements through the rigors of modernism. And if you do, if you take one of their claims and you run it through science and evidence and reason and all that, and you come up with a result that they don't like, they don't respond with science and reason and all that. They try to make an example out of you by publicly smearing you or going after your job. You might be wondering why this movement is so influential and considered credible by so many people.
Right?
And again, the answer is in anti-modernism. It didn't build credibility by substantiating its claims through objective verification. Instead, it built an environment of censorship, where in order to contribute to, say, feminism or critical race theory, it had to be within this environment of you saying things that are supportive of other feminists and critical race theorists and their writing. And within that, they built a tradition of repetition where they would repeat these collectivist beliefs from scholar to student and from person to person, from generation to generation, until it had been repeated so many times by so many people who they thought were respectable that it seemed like they must be stating some sort of fundamental truth about the world, which is all a language and power game that the original postmodernists would have critiqued.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, the original postmodernists probably would have hated these people, just maybe not. They were leftists, but they definitely wouldn't have liked them. Not at all. Rip Dr. Ness, did something happen, or are you just reacting to saying what we said earlier in the show? I mean, CRT's foundational writing specifically rejects objective. Yep.
I think this is all coming across so far as dehumanizing to radical postmodernists. So for the sake of injecting some nuance, I think you could say something that would be fair, like radical postmodernists almost certainly are trying to help. I think they just have a confused way of going about it. And even with that said, I think they almost certainly have had some major accomplishments, like taking the violence that's typically gone on until now.
Silver Ogre said they would have liked them. Sorry, I have to. They would have liked them until they turned 15. Fucking, yo, Foucault was a pedophile.
Quietly and in private against women, into taking that and turning it into a major national issue and putting a spotlight on it. And the same thing with police brutality. Making that into such a national issue has almost certainly brought down the number of unarmed people that have been killed by police. Or you could say that they've expanded our ideas and made us more tolerant of how we think men and women should behave.
No, they haven't.
But at the end of the day, all we're really talking about here is the packaging around an identity politics movement. And right now that packaging is anti-modern. So with all these achievements, there's been an uphill battle to preserve modernist values along the way. So with the example of, say, gender, there's been an uphill battle to keep us from becoming ignorant along the way about biology and genetics. So packaging can be changed, and I think that we could still be making these achievements, maybe even better, without being so hostile towards these values. And yeah, I think that pretty much catches us up to current day of the two different types of postmodernism. Right now, debate around postmodernism is a mess because one person will criticize one type of it, and another person will respond by defending this other type, and they don't realize that they're spending the debate talking past each other.
Yeah.
So hopefully this cleared some of that up, and if you want to talk about it, you can have better conversations about it. And just to be clear, the term radical postmodernism is just a term that I borrowed from the Bell Hooks paper. And it's not right now a term that people use out there in the world. So if you go around saying it, people just aren't going to know what you're talking about. These people are suggesting that we make the distinction as theoretical postmodernism versus applied postmodernism. So yeah, we'll see. Maybe that sticks and we'll use that going forward.
Looks like a bald
So
Christopher
if all that wasn't
Lloyd.
enough, let me end by leaving you with a quote by someone who's smarter than me for you to chew on. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. And with that, thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Interesting.
You know, those people. Postmodernism did dry up as everyone realized they were in a nihilistic hole. It's just a collection of things they could never put together into a whole. It didn't dry up so much as it was consumed by Marxist philosophy as a means to justify its new wave of Marxist thought. But Michael J. Sharp said that Marxism is actually on the decline in all of the institutions. You know, that one guy who wrote an article that was a critical theorist. So all hail the academic scholar Joe Lewis. He's proved that Marxism is no more and that we're all just paranoid freaks that don't understand what any of his ideas are. And that's why we should just shut up and let him educate them.
Based. Facts. I don't know. Some third thing.
You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.